Welcome back. Just days after President Trump announced a withdrawal from Syria that was denounced by his fellow Republicans, President Trump today told U.S. troops serving in Iraq that he is in no hurry to appoint a new Secretary of Defense, that the United States cannot continue to be the policeman of the world, and that it is, quote, ridiculous how many countries the U.S. has troops serving in. He also said we've knocked ISIS silly, that Turkey and Saudi Arabia will help defeat ISIS, which, by the way, he said last week were already defeated. With me now, Ambassador Christopher Hill, former U.S. ambassador to, among other countries, Iraq. He's also an MSNBC diplomacy expert. Ambassador, thank you for being here. The president is like most things, all over the place on the topic of ISIS. He's in one breath saying that they're not a threat any longer, we don't need to worry about them, and then the other breath saying, don't worry, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey are going to take care of them. What is the reality on the ground there? And then secondly, what does it mean not to have any push, any immediacy for a new Secretary of Defense?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the reality is there's no question that ISIS has been really hit very hard. This started actually during the Obama administration and continued seamlessly into the Trump administration. But of course, it doesn't mean that ISIS is done. ISIS represents sort of an extremist, very extremist view of Sunni Islam. The Sunnis in Iraq are the ones who feel that they're kind of left out. The Sunnis in Syria, or the more religious Sunnis, feel that they deserve power. So there's no question they could come back, and they don't necessarily come back in the form of ISIS. They could come back in some other form. So there's a lot to be done. I mean, one thing that is just really striking about this trip is normally when you'd have these kinds of trips, okay, you don't announce what you're going to do or where you're going to be, but you do get some people to come and meet at the airport. So the idea would normally be you would ask, for example, the Kurdish president in the northern part of Iraq, the Kurdish regional government. So you'd ask the president from there to come down to meet a senior American. He may be able to figure it out. You don't have to tell him. But then you reassure him, and then you announce we've had a good discussion with the Kurds. So you do something like that. Or, for example, the president is not going to pull troops out of Iraq. So why not have the Iraqi prime minister come to the airbase and tell him that? So you can show that you're kind of on top of the diplomatic game. And the only explanation I really have is that this administration absolutely doesn't care. They don't care what these other people think, and they certainly don't care that they have expectations from us. And finally, on the issue of a defense secretary, you know, unlike in the Justice Department, where Whitaker had never faced any confirmation process, in defense, at least the deputy, the deputy taking over, has had some a confirmation process. So you can argue, look, we're in no big hurry. He's very competent, et cetera, et cetera. But his job, Shanahan's job, is very different from the Secretary of Defense, and they ought to get going on it. And again, the only explanation is they really don't care. So if the president is trying to say, I'm not going to be like my previous presidents, he certainly is, in the fact that he just doesn't seem to care about these issues.
What about the Kurds? There is reporting that suggests that Pentagon officials are really concerned about the status of the Kurds once the Americans leave. To say that Turkey is going to take care of things, many say is basically a death wish for the Kurds. The Turkish see the Kurds as their enemy.
Yeah, you wouldn't say Turkey is going to take care of things, except in the sense of attack the Kurds. So, no, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Look, there are Kurds in Iran, there are Kurds in Iraq, there are Kurds in Turkey, and there are Kurds in Syria. And so the concern is that if the Kurds somewhere in one of those places became independent, then the other Kurds would get the same message or even join with them. So it's a complex problem. It's a very tough problem. But what you try to do is calm it down and not spin it up. And to calm it down, you need to reassure the Kurds that we love them, we want to be with them, but no, we don't support necessarily independence aspirations. And then you give a pretty tough message to the Turks, saying, Turks, we love you too, but we need to have an understanding about where we're going to go with this. And, you know, what is striking about this president, whether it's Saudi Arabia or Turkey or Russia, he doesn't seem to understand that we, not them, we have a lot of the leverage. We can tell the Turks, look, this is going to be bad for you. And you get the sense from this president that he's always worried that Saudi Arabia will stop buying things from the United States, that we'll be in trouble. We have the leverage with Saudi Arabia, not the other way around. And so consistently, this president talks tough but acts very weak.
Well, what's the alternative? And to push back, what should be what we accept for how long troops stay overseas? Should it just be an indefinite period of time? At what point does the president of the United States say and defy everybody and say, hey, listen, we've been there long enough. I don't see an end in sight. I don't see this getting better. Nothing is changing. We got to bring our men and women home.
And you're absolutely right. And, you know, in the past, you had people on the Republican side known as neocons who seemed to believe in forever war. They wanted to keep our troops there forever without a sort of clear notion of where this was going. And certainly in Syria, the president can be forgiven at looking at the issues there and say, now, wait a minute, we're trying to get regime change. We're trying to get rid of Bashar al-Assad. And at the same time, we're trying to go after one of his main enemies, that is ISIS. Does this really make sense? Are we really going to close this deal? Let's work on ISIS and let's simply, you know, let others work on Bashar al-Assad. So, you know, that would have been a sensible issue. He could have said to his military commanders, look, I want a strategy that gets us out of there, but does not create a situation where we've somehow reinforced Assad or something. And then people get to work on papers.
It's that sort of thing possible, though. I mean, we've been in these wars now for over, not Syria, but we've been in Afghanistan and Iraq for over a decade. Is what you're saying, we want to leave, but we want to keep things stable? Is that even possible?
Well, it's you know, there are no easy outcomes here, but certainly you can leave and leave behind more stability than you found. And so the idea of just precipitously leaving without any sort of iterative process, either within your own government or with regional powers, without any effort to set up a diplomatic process going forward, is a recipe for creating more problems than there are now. So I hear the argument, and a valid argument, that, look, we can't stay forever. People who say, well, we stayed in Germany for 50 years. That's not the point. The point is you've got to have some kind of end state. A lot of people have been concerned about this sort of thing for a long time. And so it's, I think, fair to raise that issue, but not in this kind of precipitous, one day you don't know anything about it, the next day the president's decided we're just going to pull up and run. And when you run, bad things can happen.
One last question for you. The president seemed to suggest that American troops overseas were doing the job of suckers today. Listen to this. We don't have the sound, but I've got the verbatim. America shouldn't be doing the fighting for every nation on earth, not being reimbursed in many cases at all. If they want us to do the fighting, they also have to pay a price. And sometimes that's also a monetary price. So we're not the suckers of the world. We're no longer the suckers, folks, and people aren't looking at us as suckers.
This is the extraordinary narrative that the president and others tell continuously. That is, the United States, in creating a world in our own image and creating the institutions, whether it's the United Nations or NATO, in creating these lasting partnerships, has somehow created a world in which we're the suckers. And I think most of the world would beg to differ. We're not the suckers. We've created a world in whose institutional framework has essentially really enshrined our leadership. We have done very well because we created this structure. And so this narrative that somehow we're losers and worse yet, we're victims is so antithetical to what is really going on out there. And again, it behooves the president now and again to crack a book on these subjects. The United States has done very well and will continue to do well, not to get involved in every awful little civil war, but rather to be aware of every awful civil war, to do what we can diplomatically, and in some cases to work with others, and sometimes even just by ourselves to deal with them. And we cannot allow things like ISIS to just be handed off to some regional countries that may or may not get the job done. And so the real problem is we have a president who simply doesn't understand his brief.
I'm not sure you could get him to open a book. He didn't even read Defense Secretary Mattis's resignation letter, and that was only 3 pages long. Ambassador Chris Hill. Ambassador, thank you very much. Happy New Year.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.